Please take your seats. The show is about to begin.
Welcome aboard.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to our first Axios House event of the day. I'm Ben Gieman, energy reporter with Axios, and we're really excited that you could all join us for this really special edition of our News Shapers events. And a quick reminder for those following along on social media, please make sure to use the hashtag Axios House. Now, we've got an unbelievable lineup both today and tomorrow. Later today, we'll hear from Amazon Chief Sustainability Officer Kara Hurst, Delta Chief Sustainability Officer Amelia DeLuca, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, and Rockefeller Foundation President Dr. Rajiv Shah, and so many more as well. And then tomorrow morning, it's going to be amazing as well. Tomorrow morning, we're hosting a live viewing of President Biden's UN address. And after that, we're going to have a live in-person analysis right afterward, and it's going to be really sharp. And then this one's great too. Tomorrow afternoon, girls education activist and Malala Fund co-founder Malala Yousafzai will be joining us too. But now let's get back to this morning. And let's get this party started. Our first guest joining me on stage is someone who kind of needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. It is former Secretary of State John Kerry.
Wow. You all managed to get up.
So yeah, let's, okay. So, Mr. Secretary, my highly placed sources are telling me that there's an election that's going to happen very soon. And so, yeah, I often hear two things about the upcoming election. One is that momentum behind the energy transition is unstoppable. The other thing at the same time that I hear is that this is the most important climate election ever. How can both of these things be true at the same time? Can you square that circle for me?
Because they are true. But look, we are in as serious a mode as I can think of with respect to climate. And unfortunately, because of Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan and a host of other things, people are having a lot of trouble, I think, in sort of selecting what do you do, where do you go, how are we going to change this? Well, obviously, there's an election in 6 weeks with a massive differential in the outcome because one person wants to pull out of Paris and go backwards and defund and do all the things that happened years ago, 4 years ago, 8 years ago. And the other wants to continue the momentum that she has actually helped create with respect to where we are. But look, I've been doing this for a long time. You have Al Gore coming on, my classmate. We went to the Senate at the same time together. And he obviously has done an enormous amount to get people to understand how serious this is. Let me just give you an example. Yesterday, there were big stories in the papers about people doing tourism to go see the last of the glaciers. And from 1970 until 2014, the warming of the glaciers was linear. It was about 1.18 centigrade per year. Now, since 2014 till now, it's at 0.28 per year. And most recently, the best scientists in the world, a group of scientists who've been involved studying the Antarctic for years, all concluded and put out that the Thwaite Glacier, which is the fundamental glacier that holds back the West Antarctic ice sheet, is now possibly going to fall apart in the next 5 years. And you could have this massive speed up in the rate at which we're seeing sea level rise, which is already rising faster than people predicted. The bottom line to what I'm saying is this. We made an agreement in Dubai that we were going to transition away from fossil fuel. We're going to do it speeding up in this decade. We're going to do it so we reach net zero 2050. And according to the science, which means you try to hold the Earth's temperature increase at 1.5 degrees. Problem? We're not doing that. We're not implementing. And there's a massive movement in the fossil fuel industry now to sort of suggest, well, gas is going to be green and gas is going to be the future. But gas is 87% methane.
Yeah.
And methane is 20 to 80 times more damaging than CO2. So we need to speed up. We must come to scale faster. We need more money dedicated to the new technologies. And if we just deployed technologies that we actually have today, solar, wind, geothermal, so forth, we would be able to meet our goal of 2030. But currently we're not. And the implications for everybody, for life itself on the planet, are gigantic.
That actually dovetails nicely with the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that we're hearing so much about fracking in this election cycle. And of course, Kamala Harris has changed the position that she had in 2019. Given your comments, do you see U.S. natural gas production as an ally in the fight against climate change or an enemy in the fight against climate change?
Well, I try not to categorize it as either, but the fact is that gas is about 30 to 50% cleaner than oil or coal. Mm-hmm. So the minute you are transitioning away from coal or away from oil, if that's what you're doing on a temporary basis, great, that's better. But if you're looking at it, and what happens is, you're talking about billions of dollars of investment, if you're investing in major new infrastructure that is going to produce new gas, that's going to be there for 30 or 40 years. And you're either going to wind up with stranded assets because the market is going to move to a different place, which is already beginning to happen, or you're going to have much more emissions being added to an already growing amount of emissions. Look, the reality is that all of the things that President Biden and Kamala Harris have been trying to do are not based on ideology. They're not political. They're not labeled Democrat, Republican. It's what science, mathematics, physics, some biology, and some chemistry are telling us we have to do. And we've agreed in Glasgow, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Dubai, that we are going to do X, Y, and Z in order to win this battle. But I have to tell you, all around the world, people are falling short or not even trying. And the fact is that good things are happening. We're making progress on batteries and on storage. We're making unbelievable progress on solar and on wind. Solar is now 90% cheaper than it was in 2009. And the price is not just competitive, it destroys the choice of doing either gas or these other efforts. So we could move much more rapidly. Last year, for the first time, and I take hope from this, $2 trillion of venture capital went into clean energy. $1 trillion went into fossil fuels. So it's the first time in history that clean energy has actually out-invested fossil fuel. I think that's going to continue. And in my judgment, it's not will we get to a low-carbon, no-carbon economy. It's will we get there in time to avoid the worst consequences of the crisis. And right now, we're not doing it. We have to come up to speed. We have to come up to scale so that we can deploy these technologies on a global basis.
You mentioned Ukraine earlier, and shortly after that, you mentioned what the science is telling us. It's very difficult to untether energy policy decisions from geopolitics. Sort of given that, in your view, and also given the kind of geopolitical leverage that U.S. LNG has provided the country, should the Biden administration resume approving U.S. LNG exports?
I don't think we need to be doing that if we are actually on a track. If it were part of a very clear, accepted ramping down and transitioning away, and you were to say, hey, this is what we have to do to not destroy our economies, and this is what we have to do to be on the track we want to be on, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But if it's just give us the permit, we're going to go out and do more LNG because there's demand for it, the demand is crushing us right now, and we can't be driven solely by that demand. I mean, look at the AI data centers that are going to be coming along. It is critical that we make sure that the energy provided for those is clean, comes from renewables, is circular and so forth. It isn't clear that's happening yet. Yeah. So I think people are not yet serious enough about the consequences of not doing what we need to do. We already have about 30 million people migrating as a consequence solely of climate. We could have the implosion of the African food capacity, and you will have tens of millions of people. And this is accepted as to what the consequences would be as a matter of science and sort of mapping of human behavior. You will have people knocking on the door of Europe, Asia to some degree, though they have some of these problems, Canada, et cetera. You're going to see massive efforts by people who say, wait a minute, what's going on here? 48 sub-Saharan African countries equals 0.55% of all the emissions in the world. 20 countries, led by China, the United States, run the list of developed countries, are responsible for almost 80% of all the emissions. So there's an anger building in the global south, which is completely understandable. And we, a $28 trillion economy, and China, an $18 trillion economy, are 47% or so of the problem and not doing anywhere near our share of getting ahead of the curve. The consequences globally and also for the United States in terms of relationships with people around the world is going to be staggering.
I'm glad you mentioned China, actually. One of the kind of fascinating things we're seeing unfold in U.S. policymaking right now is perhaps this tension between U.S. climate policy and U.S. industrial policy. And nowhere is that more evident than these 100% tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. In your view, is it wise to erect very high barriers to the import of Chinese clean technology into the U.S.?
Well, it doesn't work. It's not ultimately going to make the difference. One thing China does, they had a car that was coming in at $22,500, a very good car. We put 100% tariff on it, they'll lower the price. And they'll subsidize the lowering of the price, which is what they did with their industry. Germany and the United States created the solar industry way back in 1970s and 80s and so forth. But we sat there while China broke the rules and went ahead and dumped. But now China is the producer and deployer of more renewable energy than all the rest of the world put together. Yeah. They are selling 90% of all the panels, and they've cornered that market. So we have a real challenge to sort of come together and do the things we know how to do. I liken it, at the end of World War II, when we had to figure out how we were going to take control of the seas, how we were going to take control of the air. We were producing at the end of the war one B-24 bomber every hour on the hour from a converted automobile factory in Michigan, Liberty Factory. We were producing three equivalent of what today's container ship is, the Liberty ships that took the goods over for people to be able to accomplish the goals. And guess what? 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. We should be creating such an incentive beyond the IRA. The Inflation Reduction Act is a huge, great, important beginning, and it's had a profound impact. New battery companies, major new solar deployments and so forth, because it is providing a tax credit. It's an incentive. We need incentives like that that will create new supply chains and a radical transformation of the rate at which we are addressing this crisis, which again, I repeat, is not something dreamt up by one party or another. It began, Al Gore, who's coming on shortly, was part of the hearing with Jim Hansen back in 1988. And then in 1992, we all went to Rio. And meeting after meeting, we're now at COP29. We've got to get our act together and stop, sort of meeting and doing.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Obviously, COP29 is just, less than a couple months away now. We're approaching 10 years after the Paris Agreement. Is the COP system still fit for purpose, or does it need a sort of radical reshaping or overhauling in any respect?
I think it needs some reshaping, and I think it needs to move very rapidly, but it's going to. But the same problems that have produced outcomes that people aren't satisfied with are the same problems that are going to make getting that transformation very difficult.
How would you reshape it?
What you need now, I think, is leadership among the most the biggest emitter nations. We put together something, though, the Major Emitters Forum. And President Biden held 3 summits. At the first summit, we had President Xi, we had President Putin, it was pre-Ukraine, and people were serious. And we did raise global ambition in Glasgow. The what's called the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are each country's plans for reducing emissions. Those were reinforced. And we started sort of down a road. Sharm el-Sheikh was, frankly, a little less productive. Mm-hmm. But in Dubai, almost 200 nations agreed to the following. We will transition away from fossil fuel in a way that is fair, equitable, and orderly. We will do it accelerating in this decade. And we will do it so we reach net zero 2050. According to the science. And according to the science means holding the Earth's temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So we have the mandate. We know what we have to do. All the companies know what we have to do, the big oil producers, et cetera. And they're just plowing ahead like it's business as usual and there's no differential. And the plan for actually really transitioning at the rate we need to is just not fully defined or actually embraced.
So what's a kind of either rule change or procedural change that you think would help improve the COP process?
I think I'm not convinced that you can change that process. Multilateral diplomacy is the hardest diplomacy there is.
Yeah.
And when you have consensus decisions, which is what you have, one nation can get up and say, I'm walking out, that's it. And you don't have consensus. So you don't have a global decision. That's what governed Paris. That's why Paris wound up letting each country make up its own plan, mm-hmm. and nobody would accept a sort of a mandate structure. And in Kyoto, we had the same problem where we weren't able to succeed. The Senate just said, no way, and it was dead before it even began to be debated. So we have to get the largest nations, the largest economies, led by the United States. Look, we're 28 trillion. You know, the next, I said, is China at 18. You know what the next is? Germany at about 4. And Japan a little over 4. So the differential in what we could do is just enormous. And I think, we have to hope that the outcome on November 5th is what it needs to be for this issue and for others, and that we then can really put on the table the kinds of choices that the people of the world, not just America, that everybody needs and deserves.
You briefly mentioned the oil industry and what it is and is not doing. On a letter grade scale, and we don't give out incompletes here at Axios College. So on a letter grade scale, how is the oil industry doing on energy transition?
I can't get into letters on that. I mean, I'm not sure. Is there anything underneath Z? Look, they're doing some things, but they are things that are not going to make the difference. There's that, and some people call it greenwashing, some people call it other things. It's just not having the impact it needs. And there are serious doubts among the best minds. Go to MIT, Stanford, various places. Listen to them talk about the potential for scaling and affordability of carbon capture, storage, and utilization. They will tell you, we don't think it's possible. It's not going to happen. So we're spending huge amounts of money chasing things that are sort of placebo. I mean, they could say to people, oh, maybe this will work, maybe it won't. Can you do direct air carbon capture in a locality where you can also put it in the ground right there? Sure. Are there places we do it today? For years, the oil industry has used carbon dioxide, which has been stored, to do what's called enhanced oil production. They use it to push the oil up to the surface. But anybody I've talked to has the deepest doubts about the ability to be able to get to scale and make it affordable so it's competitive with the things we already know how to do, for which we already have the technologies. Look at, Germany right now. Germany had to go cold turkey because of what Putin did with gas, right? And Ukraine. So some people will argue that they may have gone too far with respect to taking their nuclear power offline, and they now buy nuclear power from France to make up for it. Go figure. But what's happened is that me? I have to get up.
No, we're okay.
I have to wake up.
Yeah.
Germany is already at about 50% deployment of renewables. Think about that. Yeah. And they're balancing it. They use wind from the North Sea. Mm-hmm. They're using, they've kept some coal open, very little amount, as a hedge against their economy imploding.
Yep.
But they're basically proving you can get to the very high levels of renewables. We're nowhere near that.
Yeah.
We're barely in the double digits. I mean, we're really just struggling along. And other countries that need to be doing better. And as I just said a moment ago, China, although it's focus, it's 30% of all the emissions of the planet. We're about, 10 or 11 or somewhere in there. But the fact is that China is deploying massive amounts of renewable, and it will change their peaking date. It will change their level of emissions over time.
Yeah.
If we could accelerate like that in more serious ways here, we could win. We can win this. I think if you ask Al Gore, myself, others, this is winnable. It's not as if we're facing a challenge for which we need an entire new discovery of a logarithm or some rocket scientist has to come in and say, here it is, X, Y, whatever. No. We know this is the simplest of all major global challenges we face. We are burning fossil fuel in order to propel our vehicles, heat our homes, light our factories and businesses, and we don't capture the emissions. And unless somebody can prove we're going to, we have to choose alternatives and deploy them now.
Thank you. We're running short on time. Last question for you. It's from one Massachusetts native to another. Just real quick, what are a couple ways in which Massachusetts is just so much more awesome than New York and DC?
Well, because we understand the meaning of wicked awesome. And, you have to have that touch, the Red Sox. Hard to mention the Patriots today, but we are, even Al Gore was educated there, so it's good.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay. So please stick around for our next guest with my colleague Andrew Friedman. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. I'm the second half and better half of the Generate newsletter. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already at axios.com/newsletters. Our next guest has obviously been involved in climate for quite a while in the U.S. and abroad. Please welcome former Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
The last time I was on a stage with you was at a slightly different, warmer setting outside in Dubai, where, like former Secretary Kerry, you were pretty critical of the UNFCCC process, of the COP process, but you were making an effort to reform it.
Yeah.
Where is that reform effort now? Has it gotten anywhere?
No, not really. It does need to be changed. But you know, the United Nations, for all of its greatness, and I'm so happy we have it, but it was formed at a time when the great powers did not want to invest it with independent authority to make decisions and changes. You know, that's just not, that was not in the cards. And so the institution itself is structurally weak, and so it's hard to get down to the UNFCCC process and say, okay, we're going to do it differently here. But here are some of the changes that I have recommended. I think the Secretary General of the United Nations should share in the decision of which country and which COP president should be selected each year. This is the third year in a row where it's hosted by a petrostate, and I mean, it's really ridiculous. Secondly, to require unanimity for any decision. There are some other UN bodies that have a supermajority empowered to take decisions. And the decisions the world needs to make are tough enough that getting unanimity is just unrealistic. It is difficult to change. It's going to be very difficult. But I think that having a joint approval of who the host is. You know, last year when we talked in Dubai, many people felt like it was a great victory to have that language transition away from fossil fuels. I felt that way too. You know, I was among those pushing for phasing out fossil fuels, and this was as close as they could get. But now look at the agenda for this year's COP. They've completely ignored that. And 1 month after that final document was reached in Dubai, the oil and gas lobby here in the United States started running an 8-figure advertising campaign on television every night, still going, to convince people that it's impossible to transition away from fossil fuels. So we need changes both in the way the UN operates and in the way the private sector responds to this challenge.
Since Dubai, we've seen many examples of companies and countries backing away from their ambitious climate commitments, bowing to profit pressures or worries about a coming election. Your investment company's recent report goes into detail on this, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you think may be driving this, and how to get that reversed, how to get that tide turned.
Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning Generation Investment Management. This we just put out. One of my co-founding partners, Colin LeDuc, is here. We just put out our 8th annual Sustainability Trends Report, and thank you for writing about it. You cover this issue so completely, Andrew.
I paid him to say that.
Well, that's very expensive also. But the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis, and the fossil fuel industry is the wealthiest and most powerful industry in the history of the world. And everywhere in the world, at the local level, the state or provincial level, the national level, and at the international level with these conferences, they fight ferociously to stop anything that would in any way reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. And they've proven they're way better at capturing politicians than capturing emissions. And they have used their legacy economic and political networks built up over the last century to really control the policymaking process to the extent that they can. The U.S. broke free of that. Under the Biden administration, we've got this huge new climate law. The money is finally getting out the door. We're seeing it make a huge difference. Some other countries have broken free. But some of the backsliding that you're asking about comes because of the opposition of the industry and their ability to use their captive politicians in red states, particularly, to say, look, if you move forward on helping to solve the climate crisis, you're not going to be able to do anything with our pension funds. They'll tell that to the banks and the large asset managers, and some of them are scared. Oh, excuse us, we didn't really mean it. And so that is one of the reasons for the backsliding. The other reason, I mean, it's hard. We still get almost 80% of all our energy from fossil fuels. There are a lot of good people trapped in bad systems, but we need systemic change. And luckily, we now have the alternatives that are better, cleaner, cheaper. And so what we need are policies to accelerate this transition. And that means we've got to counter the information warfare. I use the term loosely, I know, but it's kind of an information war being waged by the fossil fuel industry against the efforts to make these changes that are essential to safeguard the future of humanity.
Do you look at any particular economic sector or actor, in addition to the oil and gas industry, that's been backsliding significantly on this? You are, an investment. This was an investment company report. The banking sector is one interesting industry that has continued to fund fossil fuels at home and abroad, although many have pretty ambitious climate goals. Do you look to your peers in that sector to try to get them to lead?
Well, yes, and they should be leading. The financial services industry, especially the largest banks, have been reckless in continuing to put $7 trillion additional dollars into more expansion of more and more fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. And, the people who were saying, well, these are big energy companies, they can lead this transition. Well, that's looking for love in all the wrong places, as the country music song had it. The fossil fuel companies are not going to lead the way. And these banks and financial services companies are not going to do it unless they get a lot of pressure and policy changes. They have been putting, if you take their stock buybacks into account, the largest banks have really been putting more money into business as usual instead of what they should be putting it into. The International Energy Agency under Fatih Birol has said definitively, we shouldn't have any new development of new fossil fuel resources. We have all that we need right now to get us through this transition. Most of the electricity generating capacity installed in the world last year, more than 80%, was solar and wind. We're seeing this transition, but it's not fast enough. And we need to redirect funding much faster toward the green transition.
Extreme weather events, and later this week we may very well have Hurricane Helene making landfall in the Gulf Coast. They're making climate change a more here and now issue and hitting Americans in their wallets through the insurance industry in particular. Do you think the rising price of home insurance, be it California homeowners, Florida, even Iowa and Minnesota due to severe thunderstorms, their insurance policies, premiums are going up?
Yeah.
This is the first time in my mind when this is really a pocketbook issue for people. Do you think that'll move the needle at all, even a little bit, in a country that is so bitterly divided?
I hope it will. And yes, I do think it will. I hesitate to have a full-throated answer of yes to that, simply because we saw the city of New Orleans devastated by Hurricane Katrina. We saw this city flattened in the south part of this city by Superstorm Sandy. We've seen the fires out. We've already seen so many catastrophic consequences that are exactly what the scientists predicted would occur, and yet it has not brought us across the political tipping point yet. I think that it will. I recently checked to see what percentage of Americans have been under an extreme weather alert during the first 8 months of this year. The answer, 100%. Every single person in the United States has been at one time or another this year under an extreme weather alert. And the extremes related to the climate are getting worse regularly. When I started giving my slideshows, Andrew, on climate, I would pick examples of the various impacts from 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Now, you can say, this was yesterday, this was the day before yesterday, this is going on right now. And right now, you pointed to this intensifying hurricane coming toward the Gulf Coast. But at the same time, we have once-in-a-thousand-year rainfalls in Central Europe, unprecedented fires in Portugal, unprecedented drought in Namibia, and I could keep going. It's happening all over the world. But frankly, the fact that it is global in its dimensions is one of the reasons it's hard for us as human beings to deal with it, because we're not used to thinking in that context. But now the relationship between humanity, as our civilization is currently organized, and the surprisingly fragile ecological systems of the planet are creating a worsening crisis. And the fact that the scientists have been proven exactly correct in what they predicted would happen today should cause us to listen more carefully to what they're warning us now of what will happen in the years ahead unless we stop using the sky as an open sewer. This thin shell of atmosphere around the planet, it's blue because that's where the oxygen is, but it's so thin, if you could drive a car straight up in the air at highway speeds, you'd get to the top of that blue line in 5 to 7 minutes. You could walk it in an hour. And we're putting another 162 million tons of heat-trapping pollution into it every single day, using it as an open sewer, and it lingers there on average each molecule about 100 years. The true math, as you would know very, very well, is more complicated, but the average is about 100 years per molecule, so it builds up, and it traps as much extra heat every single day as would be released by 750,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours on the Earth. It is insane for us to allow that to continue, particularly as we now see the manifestations of the crisis worsening every day. I do think we will get to a kind of a political gag point where people who have tried to ignore it and say, well, I'm not so sure, will get to the point where they say, whoa, wait a minute, my insurance is going up, as you point out, in Florida and California and in some other. The Economist had a cover story on a $25 trillion loss in the world's housing market just because of the climate crisis by mid-century unless we act. And the list goes on. We have got to respond with much greater alacrity.
It's as if you recited some of those facts before, but
you've
they're
written
serious.
About them.
Yes,
before.
I've written about them many times.
You know, this audience may not all have heard those facts before.
That's true. That's true. Also,
I want to point out that Kamala Harris grew up in a middle-class family. Also,
thank you. I mean, I was thinking about how the theme of this year's Climate Week is it's time. Really? You know, like, it was time when you were in an elected office, multiple elected offices. It was time in 2007 when your first film came out. It was time when Sandy hit in 2012. it's just, it's kind of infuriating. But on the progress side, what encourages you on this issue? You and I have talked recently about the pace of renewable deployment. And there's clearly a lot of excitement. Climate Week is also more than 50% larger this year than last year, partly because of the IRA and its impacts. And I'm curious what gives you hope on this.
John, Kerry talked about China earlier. Let me give you one new statistic on China. From January 1 of this year through the end of July, China deployed as much new solar every month as would equal 18 new 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants every month. It's incredible. We in the United States doubled our deployment of solar last year as well. We are seeing a breakout victory by solar, cheapest electricity in the history of the world. We're now seeing very significant progress in the battery technologies that are extending the number of hours each day solar and wind electricity can be used. That is one of the reasons that I am hopeful. I'm optimistic. We're going to win this. But the question that remains is whether we will win it in time. We're in a race, and there are some negative tipping points that we need to avoid crossing over. One of them that's quite astonishing, and you've written about this as well, the Gulf Stream could shut down. Sounds like a bad science fiction. In fact, it was a science fiction movie in 2005, I think. But now you see these peer-reviewed scientific articles say it could very well happen within 25 years. What? That's incredible. The scale of these consequences must cause us to change policy more quickly. But I'm hopeful because we have seen the beginnings of some very significant changes in policy. Now, we need to remove the anti-climate activity as much as we can. And President Lincoln, our greatest president, famously said that without the support of the people, nothing is possible. With the support of the people, everything is possible. I do believe you mentioned that years ago it was time. We should have done it back then. Of course, we should have. But if you look at this climate crisis and the largest grassroots movement in the history of the world to try to bring about solutions, it fits into a pattern of all the great morally based movements in our history. You look back at the abolition of slavery, the effort to get women equality, the right to vote and equality in all things, the civil rights and anti-apartheid movements, the LGBTQ movement. In all of those movements, people felt despair. The advocates got to a point where they said, oh, is this ever going to happen? But when the underbrush of argumentation was cleared away and the central issue was revealed as a choice between what's clearly right and what's clearly wrong, then at a very deep level, the outcome became foreordained. And then things really began to change. So that's the point we are approaching now. And by the way, there is a generational shift that is a real tailwind for those of us who have been pushing for this change. And we're seeing that in countries all around the world.
Well, we're out of time. I do like to end with one fun thing. You've been in the public eye for so long. What is one thing that you don't think most people know about you?
At this point, I'm not sure there's anything, boy, what is that? Let's see. I'm not sure that there's anything that I can...
Well, what was the last song you listened to?
Let me go back to your first question, because I think that most people don't know that I've got 1,000 solar panels installed on my farm.
That's true. That's true. From comments to our stories, I can tell you that is very true. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. And
thank you for what you do, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Such important conversations that we've had so far this morning. I'm Nyla Boodoo, and I'm an Axios host and editor. And I feel like my colleague Ben Gieman upped the stakes. So I feel like I need to say I'm very excited to welcome fellow Floridian, our next guest, former Senator and current NASA Administrator Bill Nelson. Thank you for being here.
You think I'm going to drink all that water?
I mean, it's there for you if you need it. And we have them labeled so no one can reuse them. So let's start, not surprisingly, with astronauts. You have a SpaceX launch scheduled for later this week. This month, we've already had Polaris, which was the first time SpaceX had its own employees on board a mission and achieved a new record altitude. But other commercial partners, notably Boeing, and has had mission problems that have left 2 of your astronauts on the ISS until next year. I wanted to start by asking you about Boeing and its setbacks, and if you feel like that means NASA's overly reliant on SpaceX for the foreseeable future.
Understand that SpaceX is a new thing that we started as a result of Kay Bailey Hutchinson and I passing new laws in 2010 on NASA going forward. All our exploration in the past had been because we were the United States government. That's how we went to the moon half a century ago. But what we then designed, that there would be a dual track, that we would have the government program, but we would bring in commercial partners to tap that ingenuity as well as their finances so that they would share the cost. That, along with our international partners, makes our space program, particularly the human space program, so much different from the past. It's true on low Earth orbit, on the International Space Station, where we have 40-some partners internationally. It's true as we go back to the moon after a half century. By the way, not to just go to the moon, we're going to learn to live, to work in that hostile environment so we can send humans to Mars.
So that said, where do you think SpaceX then ranks in terms of all of the partnerships? Because certainly Elon Musk gets
They've been phenomenal.
Right.
They've been phenomenal. The proof's in the pudding. Look, they developed the Falcon 9 rocket. It's now the workhorse to get into space, government, commercial, defense. It's the workhorse.
Do you worry about Elon Musk and the misinformation that he spreads that detracts or distracts from NASA and its mission?
You know, the good news about that is that Elon has a president that he lets run the company, and her name is Gwen Shotwell. And she's done that. She was the 8th employee of SpaceX. And she's done a phenomenal job. And as we say in the South, the proof's in the pudding. Look at the crew to orbit, cargo to orbit. Now we'll see they, along with Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin, are going to be our 2 landers. We're going to get our astronauts to the moon in lunar orbit, and then they will transfer into first a SpaceX lander and then a Blue Origin lander.
Right, and I think it's not necessarily how SpaceX is run, as you're saying. I'm just talking about the distraction of the constant headlines about him, and if you all feel like that's a distraction.
Well, they distract you, but they don't distract NASA.
I think one of my favorite facts about Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore is that they'll be able to vote from space. And I feel like there's also been so much publicity about these astronauts who are up at the ISS. I know you all don't like to use the word stranded Why do you think this has captured so much of the public's attention, this story?
Because it's a human drama. How are we going to get our astronauts, 2 test pilots, on a test flight? And suddenly we discover that with all the testing and the evaluation, it was unanimous in NASA. My decision is the final decision. It was easy. It was unanimous in NASA that we finally knew the cause of that valve malfunctioning, but we didn't understand why. And in this day and time of putting 2 test pilots' lives on the line, we just were not going to take that risk. So, but remember what President Kennedy said. He said, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Space is hard. Space flight is risky. We have lost 17 astronauts on spacecraft. We just want to make it as safe as possible, accepting the fact that there is significant risk. And that pretty well decided the reason that we did. And that's what your question was. Why is there so much attention to it? It's a human drama of life or death.
Since we're here at UNGA Week, I wanted to ask you about NASA has now had 43 nations sign on to the Artemis Deep Space Exploration Accords. I know that you have had a meeting last week with Korea about this. How did it go? Can you tell us how much conversation you expect about that and the Outer Space Treaty this week?
Well, we're at 43, and soon, probably by the end of this year, will be over 50 nations that will have signed the Artemis Accords. What are they? They're common sense declaration of principles of peaceful use of space. I mentioned earlier, we're doing our space ventures with international partners. We're going to the moon next year, and it's 3 Americans and a Canadian. And that starts a whole series of foreign nationals as astronauts that train with us. That's already been the case in the International Space Station. Many astronauts from other nations. What it says is space exploration is for all. And I thought we were going to talk some about climate change.
We're going to get to that, yeah.
Okay, I want to lead into that by saying that, that's one of the most important things that we do. You don't think of us as a climate agency.
No, but let's talk about even how much, we want to get to the climate agency things that you do, but first just what you have done at NASA. We think about NASA's strategic assets and the work that has been done to make even the space launch pads climate resilient.
Well, we take it very serious. As a matter of fact, our aviation program, aviation research, we are developing a mid-range, single-aisle commercial aircraft with Boeing that will save 30% of fuel. It has a very thin wing, high on the fuselage so that you get the greater efficiency of the fan jet engines. 30% of fuel for the most trafficked commercial type aircraft. That's huge. So that's certainly a part of our program in our development. But we also are up there with 24 spacecraft looking down here and measuring in very detail with a composite 3D understanding of what is happening to the Earth.
And this morning you all announced some more information about your collaboration with IBM to release an AI model around weather and climate. Can you explain a little bit more about how NASA plans to make these foundational model data available and to whom?
NASA.gov, Earth.gov, all those 24 spacecraft are feeding it information real time. And that information now is available to everybody on planet Earth through the internet. Earth.gov. What the IBM agreement will do, it will enhance our processing and understanding and retrieval of data through artificial intelligence that will shorten the process in time so much, even much more so than our supercomputers now, to be able to have the relevant information for us Earthlings to be able to make decisions real time on what we can do to save our planet. By the way, it's so beautiful. When you look back at home, and home is the Earth, it's so colorful, so alive, and it's suspended in the middle of nothing. Space is nothing. And yet, there is our home. It's like Bill Anders on that first view of Earth as he came from around the far side of the moon, and for the first time he saw Earth on that revolution of the moon. Christmas, 1968. And suddenly there, Earth is rising. And he says, "Where's my camera? Where's my camera?" And he takes that shot that is so famous because it's the first time we saw Earth from a different perspective. And wasn't it beautiful? And it's up to us to save it.
Well, and it's so interesting when you talk about those pictures and the role that they played in the climate movement. I want to ask you about the data and just that missional value of NASA and how significant it is that this data is available for anyone, as you've said.
But this is the first time it's available to everybody. And then when we speed up the data, make it more understandable, particularly through the association with IBM and artificial intelligence, it's going to be all the more consumable.
How important is the role of Earth science and climate missions, would you say, to NASA?
It has become one of our major focuses in science. There's earth science, there's planetary science, there's the science of the entire universe, particularly that's been so opened up with the James Webb Space Telescope. I mean, we're peering back in time to the very beginning. We now have the pictures of the formation of the first galaxies only about 290 million years after the very beginning. And that's receiving light from 13.5 billion years ago. Now think about that. That's traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, and that light has been traveling for 13.5 billion years. For a country boy, that's a long distance. And so it's, so Earth science, looking down, is a major part of what NASA does.
One last question for you. We're unfortunately out of time, but Administrator, there is a growing sentiment of people who say that we should be addressing climate problems here on Earth rather than focusing on exploring space. What is your response to that?
Well, then, if that were to be the final decision, you'd cut the heart out of the normal human nature in us to explore, to learn the unknown. The unknown is out there. By the way, people ask me all the time, do I think there's life out there? Yes, I do. That universe is so big, and we're just discovering those other planets. And within 10, 15 years, we're going to be able to see a planet and its chemical composition to know that everything is in place as it orbits its star, its sun, that in fact there is a likelihood of life there. And so that's one of the things that makes NASA so exciting. But can I tell you a personal thing that was so exciting for me? As I orbited the Earth, and this is a long time ago, early in the space shuttle, looking back, orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes. And as an elected official, I did not see racial division, and I did not see religious division, and I did not see political division. What I saw is we are all in this together as citizens of planet Earth.
Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson.
The transition to a low-carbon economy is going to require a significant amount of capital. If we're going to achieve net zero by 2050, the International Energy Agency estimates it'll cost $100 trillion. Our own Chaim Israel called it a $150 trillion problem. The growth in the clean energy industry over the next couple decades is going to mimic what we saw with the modern technology companies in the early 2000s.
The energy transition is a massive secular theme in the world economy today as we move to non-fossil sources of energy generation, whether it be electricity and the use of wind and solar power backed by lithium-ion batteries and other forms of storage.
There'll be ample opportunities for companies to enhance and lose market position. And companies of all sizes are going to be impacted. If you're in the supply chain of a multinational that has a net zero commitment, then you too are going to have to figure out how to get to net zero. Otherwise, you're going to lose your position with that customer.
I think the top challenge our clients having reaching net zero, number one is data. The data quality of carbon emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3 is still very poor, although it's improving relatively rapidly. Two is we don't have all the science-based pathways that are considered practical and equitable to decarbonize each industry sector. And then the third is there is a tremendous amount of capital need.
In order to tackle the problem of generating the needed capital to fund the transition, contributions from both the public and private sector are necessary. Clearly, the private sector is going to have to drive investment because governments simply don't have the sufficient firepower. But governments do have a role to play by de-risking projects and providing the appropriate demand signals.
The Inflation Reduction Act provided the certainty of stability of tax credits and other incentives. So when you think about building out a green hydrogen project, when the payback is many, many years out, it is important to know that those incentives are going to be there to help support the project. The other thing that's not very well understood is, IRA really expanded the traditional tax equity market into transferability, and the direct pay for green hydrogen or carbon capture and sequestration is also a game changer.
Investors are captivated by the ability to pursue profits and purpose. We've seen significant private market flows into the space, as well as IPOs and other public equity issuance. You're seeing capital formation from a variety of sources, venture capital, entrepreneurs, big corporations all working together with support of the various governments around the world to achieve these goals.
I think everyone should feel optimistic about the net zero future. It is no longer an environmental, cultural, and value question. It is an economic proposition, and it's a business imperative.
Everyone. Thanks for sticking with us, and thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge that video brought to you from our sponsor today that made everything possible, Bank of America, so thank you. I'm Sarah K. Helani-Gu. I'm the executive editor of Axios Live and New Platforms, and thrilled to have you here along for our final segment Our last guest is an entrepreneur, a chef, a culinary icon who pioneered the farm-to-table movement. It is affecting real change in the restaurant industry to be more sustainable. Please welcome to the stage Alice Waters. We're so thrilled to have you here, Alice. We have spent this morning talking about big policy, international cooperation, and now we're going to bring this conversation down to earth and to the dirt and to the farm. You really did, many decades ago now, pioneered this farm-to-table movement that inspired restaurants, that inspired chefs, that inspired the food industry to think differently about local, about sustainable. And now to have you here at this moment, I'm curious to hear more from like what your perspective is, how much has changed, how are we doing, really? And what do we have left to do?
Well, it all began for me, actually, at the University of California in 1964. And I was part of the free speech movement and civil rights and Vietnam War. And I heard Mario Savio, who was so eloquent, and he said, you know, education is so important, and everyone should sort of experiment and take classes in different subjects. Everybody should go and travel the world and meet new people and new ideas. So that next year I went to France, and it actually changed my life because I had never been to a place that was so, what shall I say, delicious. But it was way more than that. It was the way people lived their lives. It was like farmers' markets on every street, people sitting along the Seine to go into these beautiful buildings. Even at that time, parents came home to have lunch with their children. And I just thought, what's happening here? I want to really taste this. I traveled up to Brittany. They pulled the mussels out of the water. They steamed them up, and they served them to me. They made crepes. I didn't even know I was drinking hard cider. I just wanted to go take a nap on the beach after lunch. But I understood the power of food. And it's really extraordinary. Chez Panisse has been around for 53 years. And we only had one menu when we started. And either they liked the menu or they didn't. And so I had to make it really good. And thank goodness I found a farmer, that would be Bob Kennard, who said his vegetables were more nutritious and delicious than anybody else's. And I laughed. And of course, they were. Because he was practicing regenerative organic farming way back 50 years ago. And he said to us, if I bring the vegetables to you, will you bring your compost of food to me? Because I want to put that into the ground. And it was just the beginning of my real education about how important farmers are and how much I learned over the course of these years. And I can't even begin to tell you. But we learned the most important thing is you cannot have the same thing always. And so when those blueberries are over, they're over till the next year. And I think always when people asked about where I got all the food for the restaurant, I said the word got out that we were willing to pay the real cost to the farmer. And then everybody in California wanted to sell to us. And we got Masimoto's peaches. And we got that person's little nectarines. And we were able to bring those to the table. And it's seasonality that is so critical to taste.
And that story is so resonant with people because when we talk about climate change in particular, people, it feels intangible. It can feel like, what do I as a person have to do with this? And one answer is food because we all consume it. A lot of us cook it ourselves. So I guess my question is, you have figured out how to, you've inspired other chefs and other restaurateurs. Now you're moving and have moved for some time into schools. And so what have you learned about how to scale these principles beyond inspiration? How do you take this one farmer, one cooperative agreement that then could speak to how industries can change?
Well, I have to say first that I'm a Montessori trained teacher, and I went to learn about it in London in 1968. And she, if you don't know, was the first woman doctor in Italy back there in the 1880s. And she wanted to know why children who lived in poverty and hunger could not learn like other children. And she discovered that our senses are our pathways into our minds, that we need to be touching and tasting and smelling and looking at beautiful things and listening carefully. And I understood that deeply when I was in England. And I still can remember all the trees in Hampstead Heath because we had to trace their leaves. We had to calligraph the name. And it's deep inside me what I learned. And so I applied that, of course, to Chez Panisse. And I burned rosemary out in front of the restaurant just to make you feel like you're coming into the south of France and you're eating the food of that inspired place. But I know that we have globally food and agriculture in common around the world. And I started a project in the Martin Luther King Middle School in Berkeley called the Edible Schoolyard. And get ready to open that up. But this was 30 years ago, and the principal asked me, will you come over and help me figure out how to beautify the school? There were 800 middle school kids speaking 22 different languages at home. And it was a school that was built in 1921 on 17 acres of land. So there was land that had just been wasted over to a vacant lot. And immediately I had the idea. Well, you're a little ahead of my story. I had the idea right away, a Montessori idea, that if we had a kitchen and garden classroom, we could teach all the academic subjects in those places. And yes, we were cooking in the kitchen, but we were in a geography class and we were learning about the Middle East. So we were understanding what they were eating, and we were making pita bread and hummus, and we were learning about food through all of our senses and the geography at the same time. And so, same in the garden. It could be a science class, it could be a music class, it could be an art class, or it could be a climate a climate awareness class. And it worked so well at this one school. We started to have these classes in the summer to teach people from around the world. So now you can open up the map, because in 28 years, 30 actually, it's gone into 6,500 schools. And it's turn the other side. That's the good side. I mean, we did this to understand that it worked under every kind of climate, that it wasn't culturally one place. It could be any place on the planet. These were human values. And so thinking about climate right now and the solution that could be global, I'm thinking of the procurement money of the public school system, which is spent now on fast food. And we could change that and spend the same amount of money on slow food, on local food. And we could make this really globally connecting. So we could learn from people around the world, like we have, about what plants you can grow in very hot places and cold places and wet places. It could be the most positive and, I dare say, delicious solution to climate. Can you imagine?
And can we talk? What happened to my mic? There we are. And let's talk about this. I want the audience to come away with something that feels like something they can take home to their plate, perhaps, or their home, and impart from your wisdom and what you've learned here. So just to go back to the seasonality part, I know California's taken steps in schools. You have a partnership with the University of California, but we all know that New York is not California. So I love strawberries in California, but should we not be eating them year round? How do we take that home? How do we address the local part of that when root vegetables in February are only so exciting for so long? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we can address this.
Well, let me tell you, we only have strawberries for a couple months in California. We only have peaches that long, too. Maybe it's longer than having peaches in some place in a colder climate. But there are not avocados that are available 24/7. That's a myth. It's not a myth. It is when they're grown, not organically, when they're grown with all in a very different way, and they're shipped around the world. Do you know that we never shipped food around the world before about 1950? And I grew up in New Jersey, and so we only had tomatoes in the summer, but my mother canned them so that we had them in the winter. Same with apples, same with everything. Wasn't so good, the canned asparagus. But when you stop eating everything all the time. You have a beautiful moment of rediscovering that fruit, that vegetable. And there are certain things that do very well dried, like beans. And there's a world of beans out there. There are worlds of things that can be successfully canned and dried. We have so many. I mean, I love to be able to have dates and things that can be grown in certain places. And maybe we can ship some things successfully. But I like the idea of going to those places and eating those things there. And that's certainly what happened to me in France. I'll never eat those little wild strawberries unless I go up to the mountains in Colorado and pick them myself in the woods in September. But it's that understanding about food.
I love that. I love that. We're about to get the hook. This has been great. I have we like to end on one fun thing, one final question. I have a controversial question for Alice. When you cook, do you use gas or electric? Be honest. Tell us.
Well, that's a hard question to answer because I've, of course, had a gas stove. But I also have a fireplace in my kitchen. And I like to cook in my fireplace most. But I will absolutely change to electric. No question about it. I'm anticipating doing that at Chez Benise. And we are having an institute for edible education and regenerative ag at the University of California, Davis, and it will be all electric. I think you just have to get used to it. It's not at all impossible. It's just like anything else. You learn to do it because it's important for climate. But I can't believe that I don't have an electric bill anymore in California. I have solar panels. I have an electric car. And it's amazing that when you do that also, again, you think I've got to hook the car up and recharge. But you also think, do I need to take the car? Maybe I'll walk instead. And it's a beautiful way of being in the world. Again, a sensual awakening of seeing those trees and beautiful flowers and knowing the time of year and the changing of the seasons.
Well, that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much to Alice Waters. We're lucky to have you here. Thank you, our audience. One final thank you. She brought the food to our table, literally, which is amazing. I want to thank again our sponsor, Bank of America, that made this all possible. This concludes today's event, this morning's event. We have a lot more events coming later today and tomorrow. The next event starts at noon. If you can join us and come back, that would be amazing. We're going to have Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm here, as well as Rockefeller CEO Dr. Rajiv Shah and more. So hope you can join us at that one or a future one over the next couple days. Thank you for being here.